Hey everybody, now that we have read our first short story together, what we're going to do is take a minute to review 4 of our focus literary devices for the most dangerous game. Think of this as sort of like a crash course in everything you need to know about setting, conflict, plot, and character all in one nice video. So let's get started. So our first element we want to review is setting. Setting is known as the surroundings and the time in which the events of a story take place, right? Pretty basic. Now, one thing that we want to remember is that the setting is developed by the author just like a character is developed, and they unfold little details of the setting just like they develop a character within the story. And so our job as the reader is to collect those details and put the pieces together so that we can really envision and immerse ourselves within the world of this story. Now, we can get those details in a few different ways. For one thing, the author's going to describe them. They're going to give us tons of sensory details that are used to describe that surroundings for us to be able to imagine. So they're going to tell us what we can smell in this world and what we can hear and what we see when we look left and right within the world of this story. We can also learn about the setting through the characters themselves. We want to listen to what the characters say and what they think about their environment and how they interact with it. All of these details help us to really crystallize that image of where this story takes place. And that's a very, very important part of being a very attentive and critical reader. Another point I want to emphasize is that setting should not be undervalued as an element. It is awesome. It's so much more than just a pretty backdrop for the story, right? What we know is that setting can serve to create mood and atmosphere. We saw this so prominently in The Most Dangerous Game. Think of how important that island atmosphere was to creating that dark and creepy and suspenseful mood. We also know that setting can contribute to the story by creating conflicts that motivate and shape the central characters. There were so many conflicts that could only occur on that particular island setting, right? The isolation of the island is what allowed General Zaroff to create and keep playing this game. And then, of course, all of the physical obstacles that this island presented Rainsford increased the intensity of the challenge between these two men once they actually began fighting each other. It's always important to remember that settings can also carry symbolic meaning. Not always, but it never hurts to give it a thought as you are reading a text. Okay, what is it that this particular setting might mean beyond its literal self, right? And last but not least, it's always useful to sort of think of the setting as sort of a character within the story. A lot of times they can function very much like a character. As we've just said, they are developed by the author, detail by detail. And what we also know is that they can really play a strong role in creating those conflicts. So don't discount the importance of that setting. Speaking of conflict, let's focus in on this particular element and all of the different impacts it can have on a story and the different categories that conflict can be divided up into. So in its most basic form, all conflict is basically the struggle between opposing forces, right? One thing is pushing one way and there's something else pushing up against it. Now, you have to accept the fact that conflict is essential to any story. That means you have to have it. If you have a story that doesn't have any conflict in any way, there's no point in reading it. That's the whole reason we pick up a book or we turn on a movie or we watch a TV show. We want to watch characters face problems, react to those problems, and then figure out how to solve those problems. So in its most simple sense, it's kind of helpful to think about conflicts as problems, all right? So if that helps you to identify the conflicts within a story, that's a good analogy to use for yourself. Conflicts are just problems. Now, problems can be big or they can be little, right? We also know that they can be physical or they could be mental or maybe emotional or societal. They can be lots of different types of problems. And of course, sometimes though they are resolved by the end of a story. That's always so satisfying to see, how the story comes to an end and how that problem is fixed or dealt with. But what we also know through experience is that there are some times when an author leaves us just sort of hanging there. They leave the resolution of that conflict sort of unsettled. Now, sometimes they do that because that's the feeling they want us to be left with, even as icky and frustrating as it is. Or in other cases, we have authors that are setting us up for a sequel. So although in the majority of cases, those central conflicts are resolved, it's always important to leave yourself open to the possibility that some authors will leave them slightly unsettled. Now, we sort of alluded to this previously, but it's important to remember that stories contain multiple conflicts. That's what keeps us engaged from beginning to end. Now, there's typically one primary conflict around which the whole story revolves, but there are lots of little conflicts that can spiral off of that conflict or that can lead up to that conflict. So keep your eyes out for problems that appear in lots of different ways. Now let's get back to that idea of categorizing conflict. So the first category that we have is called man versus man. Kind of leaves the girls out, but of course that includes women versus women and women versus men. We're basically just talking about one character in conflict with another. Now, because that is a conflict outside of oneself, we call that an external conflict. This could be a physical battle, a disagreement, or maybe even just a competition between two characters. We also know that characters can be in conflict with nature itself, right? So that also constitutes an external conflict and may be exemplified by something like a character who is stranded in a snowstorm. We definitely saw lots of man versus nature conflict in The Most Dangerous Game, although the primary conflict was, of course, man versus man, Rainsford versus Zeroff. We also have man versus society, which again is an external conflict, something outside of our character. This could be a character standing up against racism. But in the case of The Most Dangerous Game, of course, society certainly doesn't agree with this insane game that Zeroff has invented, right? We believe that the hunting of human beings is murder, not sport. And so Zeroff is technically in conflict with society's norms and morals. Now, last but not least, we don't want to disregard the kinds of conflicts that occur within characters themselves. And these are things that we can all relate to, right? Internal conflicts have to do with feelings, things like doubt or fear, or maybe a character facing a moral dilemma or a really difficult decision. Those all occur within a character's mind and heart, and therefore we call them internal. Now, just to continue emphasizing the importance of conflict, some of the different roles that it can play within a story is it can actually drive the plot. It can keep things moving, right? Think about that upward rising action slope, right? One conflict leads to another, and therefore it kind of drives things forward. We also know that conflicts can motivate characters to act. They give them purpose. They give them reason to behave and react in certain ways. And sometimes we even see how these conflicts can change a character. Think about Rainsford from the beginning to the end of The Most Dangerous Game. He goes through a full transformation in terms of his understanding of animals and the fear that they experience when they're hunted. Now, some conflicts can even lead readers right to the story's central theme or lesson or message that we're supposed to take away. We can always ask ourselves the question, so what lessons do readers or characters learn by facing this conflict? And then in turn, those are oftentimes the lessons that we as the reader are supposed to take away. All right, let's focus now on plot. Plot is basically the sequence of events that makes up a story and together create action and produce drama. One of the simplest, but most common confusions that I see my students make is that they think of plot as one thing. But plot is just an umbrella term for lots of things. It's every single event that takes place within a story. Now, we use what is called Freytag's pyramid to sort of represent all of those different events and their relationship to each other. All right, so if we look at the actual design of this diagram, it helps us to remember the function of each of these parts. So for example, exposition is the beginning part of the story. It's when we're being introduced to our characters and we are getting familiar with our setting and getting caught up on anything that happened before the story started. But of course, there's no actual conflict yet. So you can see that this is represented as a flat line. We don't have conflict until we achieve the inciting incident, right? Once that inciting incident occurs, now the story really starts to hit its stride. Now we have a problem that needs to be solved. In our case, Rainsford falling off of the yacht is the single incident that launches our story forward into the rising action. Now we have nothing but problems, right? Problem after problem. And the rising action, of course, makes up the majority of our story. The climax represents the point at which the entire story has been leading up to, right? This is usually the moment of greatest intensity and greatest interest in the reader. In a traditional like superhero movie, it's usually like the last big battle between the good guy and the bad guy. Another way to think of the climax is as the turning point, right? Because after this moment, the world of the story is forever changed, right? And as you can see on the diagram, we're making a literal turn. It is a literal turning point. We're no longer going up. We are starting to wind down. And that is truly what the falling action is about. We're winding down the story, working towards that resolution, which is the end of that central conflict. And because that central conflict has been resolved, we return to a flat line. Now notice, we don't go all the way back down here to a flat line. That would indicate that, we're right back to where we began in the beginning. But of course, we're at a slightly different place because our characters have learned things. Our characters have grown. We as readers are hopefully different in our own perspectives and thoughts about what has occurred within this story. So each of these pieces of the diagram helps to visually emphasize the importance and significance of each of these parts of our plot. Now, plots are sort of interesting. We like to think that every story is original, right? Of course, that is not the case. In some cases, we have what are called classic or archetypal plots. If you're ever watching a movie or reading a story, and in your rational mind, you've never read this or never seen this before, but you just get that sort of that feeling like, I kind of already know what's going to happen. I feel like I've already heard this story before. Well, that's probably because you are reading or viewing a classic or archetypal plot. Not every story necessarily breaks the mold, right? In fact, some stories sort of fall into patterns that are rewritten over and over again with slight variations and slightly different characters, just enough to make it feel new. Some examples of classic or archetypal plots include the battle between good and evil, right? Think about every superhero movie you've ever watched, or the meeting of two star-crossed lovers, two people that really shouldn't be together for whatever reason, but can't resist falling in love with each other, and then of course have to fend off the world or their families or whatever it is that keeps them apart. We also have stories like A Great Quest. Think about so many great novels and movies follow that archetypal plot of a great quest. Think Lord of the Rings, perhaps. And then, of course, here's another one, rags to riches. We always see how maybe there is this struggling character at the beginning, and they go through this big transformation where they have a big change in fortune. Now, these are just a handful of examples. There are lots and lots of different archetypal plots.